Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to the UNESCO Regional Office, the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, and the International Center for Human Science for the invitation to speak at these forums. Definitely a privilege and a pleasure for me, partly because those of us at CODESRIA have had a desire to develop and grow lasting partnerships with colleagues in the global south, and the Arab Council obviously has provided us with an opportunity to do this, and really happy to see Darina, whose center I visited a while ago in Byblos. I wanted to make an intervention that speaks to what CODESRIA does around the humanities. CODESRIA is slightly less than 45 years old, and it is a social science research organization, just like the Arab Council is. But incidentally, without necessarily planning it to be so, we've had a huge community of colleagues, researchers, policymakers who work within the humanities and who privilege the humanities as an entry point into studying society. And so roughly 30 to 40% of our community, roughly the same percentage, have been engaged in work on the humanities, and the Council has, without necessarily planning for it, been directly engaged with the humanities over its lifespan. And the nature of the work that we do and how we do it has had important and lasting impact in relation to the humanities. Incidentally, and as this presentation will shortly demonstrate, with an emphasis on what in our case we call transcending boundaries, and what in this sense has been described as a humanities beyond borders. Because in our conceptualization, boundaries have been treated less as realities that deter movement of ideas and people, but rather as those markers in life that only provide conceptual clarity in relation to what we seek to do. And so in terms of our funding research, in terms of publishing work in the humanities, and also in terms of what generally we do in the social sciences, in every sense of the word, the humanities have provided a useful background against which work around our understanding of society has been understood. But even more importantly, in centering the human as the core reason why we seek knowledge, as the core reason why we advance knowledge, the humanities have been useful in directing us to areas where we constantly are reminded that it's always about the people, it's always about the humanities. And without, therefore, any apologies, have centered human interactions as critical to the kind of work that we seek to do. In essence, therefore, what we do at the Council and what we seek to promote in relation to the African continent and its diaspora, I must emphasize, has been to encourage interdisciplinary conversations that allow for a better understanding of humanity, but also that displace, mimic, and also make it difficult for boundaries to be those things that limit the capacity of human imagination, if you will. And sometime around 1996, 97, the Council then formally began to run a project on the humanities with a clear emphasis on the centrality of philosophical orientations, but also methodologies that allow for the humanities to come. And again, interestingly, the project was called Transcending Boundaries. It was located at the University of Ghana, Legon, and it mobilized scholars in the social sciences and humanities to do quite an interesting sets of work, cutting across disciplines like philosophy, like film, music, and art, and across the board emphasizing the importance of the historical connections that make human life intelligible. And so in a sense, while the Council has been a useful site for work around the humanities with an emphasis on transcending boundaries, we still feel dissatisfied today that we have not done nearly enough. And perhaps for me, my own reading of what CODESRIA has done on the African continent around the humanities has been that even though we have been a nice home for scholars in the humanities, we've not been able to create a huge Pan-African community, to turn CODESRIA, the Council, into a home for a huge Pan-African community, having conversations that make us understand exactly what it is that the challenges of humanity are on the basis of our own preferred thematic on transcending boundaries. So we have a rich tradition of writings on philosophy, on film, on music, on art. We actually do organize every 2 years a conference at the film festival in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso that raises these questions for us. But I would say that a harsh judgment on us has been that we haven't become really a Pan-African home for the humanities. But even more importantly for us, I don't think that we have been a useful partner in terms of developing both a Pan-African and also a Pan-Arab, if you will, community of scholarship in the sense in which we would want to around the humanities. That conversations are happening between North Africa and the rest of Africa, and dissolving this artificial boundary that distinguishes North Africa and quote unquote sub-Saharan Africa. Those conversations continue, but I think there is some clarity that is needed, and I think as an agenda, this is something that we need to work on. So we have a community of scholarship in Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and they flow down into the Maghreb, all the way into the Sahel, to borrow that word, if you will. And we mobilize a lot of traditions that have crossed boundaries between North Africa into the rest of Africa. We've done a lot of work around dissolving this Sahara boundary, if you will. And the humanities have made a significant contribution in this through traditions of learning that have crossed the desert, if you will, huge centers of learning in places like Timbuktu, if you will. But we haven't created a sufficient body of knowledge, but also a sufficient community of scholarship and a sufficient community of practitioners in the humanities that can begin to help us enlarge and dissolve, can help us enlarge the community and dissolve this boundary. And I think that there is an opportunity for both CODESRIA and the Arab Council to figure out ways of furthering this discussion. And just the fact of knowing each other is important to this. But unfortunately, and this is my major second point, is that the humanities face challenges that make this task that I'm putting on the agenda rather difficult. And one of those key is the nature of higher education and the transformations that have taken place in the higher education sector, both in the Arab world on the one hand and in Africa on the other hand. And I'm making this, making the assumption that we understand that both the Arab Council and the CODESRIA share an overlapping patchwork of zones that we work in at the same time, and we have communities of scholarship there. The nature of higher education across the continent in Africa, and I believe also in the Arab world, has changed over the last few years in ways that make it difficult to promote the agenda that I articulated in the first point. With a serious process of defunding higher education across the African continent, with a growing community of, a growing set of institutions of higher learning in the Arab world, in the African continent that emphasize what one would call the neoliberal logic, focusing on profits making it difficult for more and more people who need education to access it, partly because of resource problems, and with different countries running away from funding higher education. And with education actually being subjected to the old World Bank language of rates of return on investment, it's become very difficult, especially for people to access higher education across the continent. And I know that in the Arab world, but also in the African world, a growing attempt by even public universities to engage more and more into private provision of education. In the Arab world, I believe, emerging institutions of higher learning that in a sense are satellites of universities located mainly in the US, and limited, if you will, South-South partnerships that enhance. So we know less and less about what's happening in India. We know less and less generally about what's happening in Asia, where we could have fruitful partnerships that appreciate the value of the humanities. With the logic of rates of return on investment, across the continent in Africa, there has been a de-emphasis on the humanities and an attempt to foist onto communities the importance of what they call the STEM subjects, with government officials explicitly stating that you cannot fund subjects like history and philosophy because they only create critical human beings who make it difficult for governments to govern, if you will. And those of us who lived through the Arab Spring, if you excuse my choice of word there, you then begin to understand why the humanities therefore become useful in context of growing dictatorships and growing authoritarianism. One can detect therefore in the recent changes around higher education in Africa, the chronic underfunding, the de-emphasis of the humanities as important contributors to knowledge, a desire to begin to circumscribe the limits of what is known. But actually that is the domain of the humanities, because a key part of the relevance of the humanities in the context of globalization, and of course with its attendant desire to compress time and to also compress space, has been the unleashing of the imagination. People now do things that 4 decades ago could not be done. And that unleashing of the imagination has been at the core of recent moves around the humanities, where people in the humanities indeed, in reality, transcend boundaries by taking advantage of modern technologies, by raising questions to communities, governance structures that make it impossible. But I think the consequence of this, at least for the African continent, is that the humanities therefore tends to be practiced a lot more freely, a lot more frequently outside the university and tertiary institutions than it is within the universities. And the proliferation of organizations, for literature, for music, for critical thinking, for film and all that, operating outside the framework of higher education institutions. This is a reality in Africa, and doing very interesting things that attract a lot of attention, that earn money, and that make it possible for communities of interested in the humanities to believe in themselves. But I think the tragedy for us as councils of higher education, as officers that are involved in policy work, the tragedy of this moment is that this is happening outside the university. And while it is a good thing that it's happening, there is something about disciplinary orientations that allow things to be a lot more sustainable, intelligible, if one has gone through the basic trainings about ideology, philosophy, methodology. And in Africa, at least, one gets a sense that this community practicing things that are outside, are within the domain of the humanities, but outside the university, have tended to convey the message that, going into higher education, higher institutions of learning, and spending time understanding issues to do with the theory and the methodology is a waste of time, partly because you can just do it anyway outside the university. And yes, that is something that is itself a critique of the institutions of learning that we have. but also dangerous in many ways because it makes it really difficult. And so within the context of this development has been the emergence of the humanities as a commodity, that which you sell in order to make money, with the influence of Western institutions of creativity, Hollywood and all that. The humanities has become a commodity. You get in there, you deploy your creativity for purposes of earning a return, not necessarily for purposes of transforming society. And if you do in the end transform society, that is coincidental to the whole process rather than a part of what you want to do. It has led to, however, interesting things that I can detect, and I just want to conclude with two of them. One of which has been to enable communities to have conversations about difficult topics, topics that otherwise would not be discussed. I think, to borrow the title of a book that was written by the Ugandan author, John Ruganda, it has allowed us, the humanities have allowed us to tell the truth laughing, to mobilize leaders to laugh at themselves occasionally when they know and occasionally when they don't know. And I think North Africa is a perfect example, but also the Arab world is a perfect example, where communities are in total distress. Life seems unlivable, but communities are able to talk to each other and tell the truth laughingly. And finally, I would say, therefore, that these conversations need to be enhanced, and we need to find frameworks around which we can deal with some of the serious questions that confront our societies across the board, irrespective of boundaries. Questions of peace and security, mobilizing gendered stories to be able to tell not just the stories of male, but also the stories of women and the stories of the youth, and being able to capture those about topics that people don't want to talk about, sexuality, for instance, dealing with questions of race and race relations, therefore centering all those. So I just want to conclude by saying that, you know, it's a rich experience that we have, and I hope that we can have more of these conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Murunga. I am sure your appeal for greater cooperation between Pan-African and Pan-Arab leagues of thinkers and philosophers, whether it's CODESRIA or other organizations, will not remain unresponded.